there's different kind of derivations of that and kind of different sub-positions, but that's the basic line of thinking, that Genesis is very genealogical, and therefore the most contextually appropriate interpretation is to continue that following of the Cainites and the Sethites.
Yeah, and just to further kind of solidify that point, we obviously Adam is called the son of God in Luke, but you can even stay within the book of Genesis. Adam is made in the likeness of God. Seth is described as being in the likeness of Adam, right? So that's clearly an interpretation, a nuance already present in the story. So calling Seth a son of God is certainly not a stretch with kind of the terminology already being employed. Now, why would their offspring of these two lines be called the fallen ones? Well, if it is Nephal, to fall, well, that makes sense. They have fallen away from God's plan. If it's from the other root, so this is not the Aramaic root, but another potential Hebrew root is Nephilah, which refers to stillbirth or abnormal birth. Something's been malformed, something's untimely in this child. It could be a shot at look, this is not what humanity is supposed to be. They are mingling these lines, and that is itself problematic. So as Tim said, there's a lot of different nuances. We're kind of trying to throw a broad canvas over lots of little smaller interpretations. But this would kind of be the second major position. Our third major interpretation would have to do with interpreting these as kings of the antediluvian, which is one of my favorite words, so I'm sorry I keep saying it, but before the flood world. So sons of God, talk about with our fourth option, is used of angels quite frequently. It's also used, though, of kings, the sons of God. And this fits in an ancient Near Eastern context. Most cultures thought their kings were related to the gods. Pharaoh was the son of Ra, right? It makes sense. Well, what's this passage talking about? It does seem to be talking about the leaders of the world and showing that they are truly wicked people. So the sons of God here could simply mean kings. There's nothing more going on here than that. They're wicked leaders, and they are fallen, not in the sense of angels fallen from heaven, but fallen in battle. That is a usage of the term Nephal elsewhere in the Old Testament. So these could simply be, as any fan of mythology talks about, right? The noble kings and heroes of old who have died almost always in battle in mythologies. And so it would be fitting into that archetype. So giants, mixing of the Seth and Cainite lines, or this simply could be talking about the kings and the rulers of the world before the flood. Anything I'm missing on that one, Tim, before we get to the contentious fourth option?
Yeah, I don't think so, except that I want to say, and our listeners will probably intuitively understand this, those first three categories are not mutually exclusive, right? It could be possible that the children of Seth are also very large, at least from modern standards, and they're also kings. So it could be, a combination of those. And that's where some of the interpretations get interesting, because there's A, B, and C, but it could be a mixture of A, B, and C. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point. Part of me, I begin pulling at Occam's razor. I'm like, I kind of want a simple answer. I don't necessarily want to go to a complex answer unless I have reason to. But there's also no objection necessarily to say, hey, it is a mix. They certainly don't exclude one another.
Yeah.
This fourth option, though, is mutually exclusive.
Yes.
And this is I'm going to say the odd one, but it's odd because we're modern readers. But from a historical perspective, this is the prominent and dominant position. And that is the view that the Nephilim are fallen angels, or perhaps better, they are half angels because they are the byproducts of angels and women. Now, you might be going, oh, hold up. They have gone off the deep end. Well, yes, but let's talk about this interpretation and why someone might hold this. So in seminary, Tim, I got the opportunity to take a class with Tom Schreiner. He was doing a guest lecture at Phoenix Seminary. It was fantastic. And he had this to say when we were talking about this passage. He said the nearly universal view of the Jewish people and interpretation is that the Nephilim are demons. They are products of both a human and a angelic, right, union. And that's certainly shocking to us. We have a very materialistic, I don't want to say anti-supernatural reading of the text, but we are products of the Enlightenment. We like to have things be very material focused. But that is out of step with Jewish tradition. Now, why would they have such a weird interpretation? Tim, what are some of the data points that they would point to say, like, no, this makes sense, that this is talking about a crazy and evil union?
Yeah, well, I think the linchpin of the argument is the description, the sons of God.
The B'nai Elohim. Yep.
The B'nai Elohim, that's right. So we see that, as Brian, you know well, that's the description used of the angelic beings, and I'm using angel there as the most generic term for a lot of different supernatural beings. The sons of God is the description that's used in Job when angels are clearly in view. There are other passages.
1:1. Yep.
Job 1:1. Yeah. Psalm 89, verse 6, the sons of God.
Mm-hmm.
There are undeniable, clear references where sons of God clearly means supernatural, angelic beings. And so interpreters, and this is what the Jewish people did, they said, well, in sons of God in those situations are very, very clearly referring to angels, and therefore sons of God in this scenario likely refers to angels as well. And so that seems very odd. Like, what would it mean that the sons of God would come and take women for themselves? But they say, well, that's what the text says. And so it may seem weird to us, but that's what happened. Also, the other reason that some look to here is to say, okay, well, if it is, demons procreating with women, then that gives us at least some of the reason as to why God sends a worldwide flood. In other words, he's got to eradicate this fallen race because, at least on some interpretations, those demons weren't simply or merely trying to procreate with women for lustful reasons, but they recognized that God was using these humans to lead toward redemption. So basically, they were intentionally trying to spoil the seed of humanity. And so the sons of God were engaged in a nefarious plot to really to deny and destroy God's plan of salvation. So they procreate with women and therefore dilute or pollute the seed. It gives a reason for a worldwide flood, which is that God has to start over with a pure human race. That's at least part of the interpretation and part of the reason that people read it that way.
Yeah, because the Nephilim aren't explicitly listed as the cause for the flood, but it is not a stretch to go, why? And right, as this author is putting the flood narrative together, we are given a prologue and the backstory as to why the flood is going to come, right? God sees the state of the world and says, this has to stop. Well, we know that the intention of man's heart is on sin continually. That does not change with the flood. So what, you could phrase it this way, what was then that is not now? Because it's not just sin. There seemed to be something else. And so this view does have the advantage of going, that would make some sense. Now, Tim, our listeners might be following us and going, okay, I get sons of God can mean angels, and that seems to then be an interpretation, but but we have the New Testament. Jesus, in talking about marriage, says angels do not marry nor are given in marriage.
Yes.
Case closed. It can't be angels, right? Or can it? Maybe I'm splitting hairs, but Jesus says angels don't marry. We are all keenly aware marriage is not what produces babies. It might be the proper union and proper place for that to take place, but marriage is not the same as sexual intercourse.
Right.
It is interesting. I don't want to push this too far, but people that would go down this interpretive option would say every time an angel appears, it looks like a man. It's always described with masculine features. So that's somewhat interesting. You could also argue, if you're looking to New Testament support for this reading, I didn't have this in our notes, but I want to call attention to Jude. Hey, Jude. No, I can't sing the Beatles. But Jude, and specifically Jude 6. Remember, Jude's a single chapter, so there's no chapter and verse. But it is interesting. Jude is very keen with the Old Testament, trying to like weave together the narrative. Here's something interesting he says. And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he is kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Now, this is interesting because he cannot be talking about the general fall of the angels. Because did you notice these angels are kept under chains? These are not Satan and his forces. This is something else. These are angels who did not keep their proper place, but left. In the very next verse, it's going to be Sodom and Gomorrah. So some interpreters would say, look, we do have this kind of not just sin, but sexual sin and impropriety kind of running through. Is this the story Jude is drawing from? Anyway, so these are some of the points that people would argue. It's the dominant historical position for at least Judaism. You have some verse support. Anything else we should consider here, Tim, before we kind of give a recap of the views and maybe put out our views before we talk about what's the point of the passage in the first place?
Yeah, I think the one thing I want to add is when we say it's the dominant Jewish position, we're thinking of particular books that are part of what we would call the Jewish pseudepigrapha, where there are a lot of different books that really go back and seek to fill in some of these details. You know, we just have a handful of verses that describe this, but a book like First Enoch, right? Or there's many others that go into detail about who these demons were and what they were trying to do and what their rebellion looked like. And this is where it's easy to get kind of sucked into that rabbit hole. But those are the works that we're describing. In other words, this is not something we have to guess what Jewish people thought of this. There are many works that go into vivid detail about all of these things.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And we've talked about these kind of Second Temple writings before. Here is a place where they do help. Even if we don't view them as inspired scripture, they do let us know what were Jewish people thinking at this time? How would they interpret these passages? And we do see that this is their clear interpretation. So although you might find different nuances, we're going to say there are four broad categories of thought when it comes to the Nephilim. They could be giants, physical description. They could be the sons of Cain and Seth. They could be kings, or they could be fallen angels. Now, the one thing we haven't talked about is how Numbers fits into this, because the Nephilim are seen by the spies in the land of Canaan. Now, if they're giants, it's a physical description. There's no actual connection between these two groups. It's simply a descriptor, right? They are gigantic people. If it is the line of Seth and Cain, that becomes a more interesting question. Who or what are they seeing? Why are they using this term? Same with kings, same with fallen angels. All three of those, it would seem to go, well, what's the connection to the book of Numbers? For, I think, all three of these views, Tim, the way you would respond is by saying the spies are lying. Now, that does seem to fit, at least in my mind, when I read the Numbers account. These are the spies who are going to say, we don't trust God. We're not going into the promised land. And they bring I don't have the Hebrew in front of me, but I think it's a bad report, an evil report. Why are we assuming they're telling the truth? If they want to keep Israel out, what better way than to pull out a boogeyman? Doesn't matter if it's real or not, right? You're pulling out this horrifying monster of the antediluvian world. I'm going to keep using it, listeners. You can't stop me. To shut people down. So in that case, there is no connection because it's a lie. If it's giants, they're actually probably telling the truth because there are giants in the land. So that's, I think, how you'd handle the Numbers question for Nephilim for all four of the views. Am I forgetting anything, Tim?
I don't think so. So we need a big drum roll. What's the big point? Right, and then we'll give our own views of what's going on here.
All right, so drum roll. Listeners, we didn't put down our own interpretation here, so this is kind of live. So Tim, let's say there's a gun to your head, and I want to say, before we get started, this is not a tier 1 issue for either of us. We're not going to die on this interpretive hill. So just putting that out there. But let's say there's a gun to your head, Tim. Which of the four views today do you find most convincing?